Hollywood has made a fortune glamorizing war, but ask anyone who's actually been in combat and they'll tell you, most movies get it dead wrong. The grit, the fear, the mud that never washes out, it's usually scrubbed away for box office shine. But a handful of forgotten films cut closer to the bone, so real that veterans nodded in recognition. Which ones earned their respect? Stick around, because some of these titles will genuinely surprise you. The Hill, 1965. Forget the explosions, the tanks, and the patriotic music. Sidney Lumet's The Hill is a war movie where the battlefield is a British military prison in the blazing Sahara. Sean Connery, desperate to shed his James Bond tuxedo, plays a disgraced soldier locked in a nightmare of heat, stone walls, and punishment drills that break men down to the bone. The Hill isn't a metaphor. It's an actual man-made mound of sand and gravel the prisoners are forced to climb over and over until they collapse. What makes this film unforgettable is its raw psychological warfare. The enemy isn't Nazis or Japanese soldiers. It's your own commanding officers. The sadistic sergeant major, played with terrifying intensity by Harry Andrews, becomes the symbol of how institutions can chew men up long after the shooting stops. Veterans recognize the claustrophobic realism, the sweat-drenched exhaustion, the stripped dignity, the quiet defiance. It all rang true. The Hill didn't storm the box office, but it stormed reputations. Critics hailed it as one of Lumet's most fearless works. Connery himself called it one of his proudest performances, a role that let him prove he was more than a martini-swilling spy. The film is harsh, unflinching, and all too real. No wonder many soldiers said, "This one got it right." The Big Red One, 1980. When World War II veteran Samuel Fuller made The Big Red One, he wasn't telling Hollywood fairy tales. He was telling his own story. Fuller had fought with the 1st Infantry Division, the real Big Red One, from North Africa to Normandy. His memories of foxholes, mud, and men dying in silence shaped every gritty frame of this film. Lee Marvin leads the cast as a weary sergeant who's seen it all, guiding a squad of green soldiers through Europe's killing fields. Unlike glossy war epics, The Big Red One feels jagged, raw, and sometimes unfinished, and that's the point. War isn't neat. Fuller wanted the chaos to seep into the film itself, as if the audience had been dropped into a trench. Veterans who watched it recognized the authenticity immediately. The long marches, the empty eyes, the absurd mix of horror and boredom, this was the real deal. Fuller even said he wanted people to feel the war's smell, that unforgettable mix of sweat, cordite, and fear. The movie didn't rake in massive profits, partly because it was released in a decade drowning in big-budget blockbusters. But its legacy endures. Decades later, critics restored the film to Fuller's original vision, giving it the recognition it deserved. The Big Red One remains one of the truest depictions of soldiers slogging through World War II. Not heroes, not villains, just men trying to survive another day. The Steel Helmet, 1951. Hollywood barely blinked at the Korean War, but Samuel Fuller, again drawing from his own combat experience, made the Steel Helmet on a shoestring budget, and veterans swore it nailed the truth. Shot in 10 days with almost no money, the film follows a cynical American sergeant and a ragtag band of survivors trying to survive behind enemy lines. The helmets look dented, the uniforms filthy, and the faces lined with exhaustion. There's no glamour here, just paranoia, suspicion, and the nagging question of whether anyone will live to see sunrise. For audiences in 1951, this was a gut punch. The war was still raging. The film's unvarnished portrayal of mistrust, fear, and racial tension among the soldiers was far too close to reality. Fuller didn't just rely on imagination. He'd been a decorated veteran of World War II and poured his memories straight into the script. The soldiers weren't flawless heroes. They were messy, bitter, and sometimes broken. Veterans in the audience nodded. They'd seen those faces in their own units. The Steel Helmet sparked outrage from military brass, who hated its honesty, but audiences and critics recognized it as groundbreaking. Fuller made war look like what it was: dirty, confusing, and merciless. Veterans respected that he didn't flinch, and that's why this forgotten little film still carries weight decades later. Go Tell the Spartans, 1978. By the late 1970s, Hollywood had churned out plenty of flashy Vietnam War films. But Go Tell the Spartans wasn't flashy. It was stripped down and brutally real. Burt Lancaster, already in the twilight of his career, plays a weary officer stationed in Vietnam in 1964, just as America was slipping deeper into the quicksand. There are no sweeping battle scenes here, no victory parades, no epic scores swelling over a flag. Instead, there's mud, wasted lives, and orders that make no sense. Veterans who served early in the conflict praise the film for capturing the bitter absurdity of fighting for hills that would be abandoned days later. Director Ted Post avoided glamour and focused on futility. The film shows soldiers struggling not with courage but with bureaucracy, bad intel, and the crushing realization that they were pawns in a game already lost. Critics at the time shrugged it off, saying it was too bleak. But veterans knew better. This was how it felt: lonely, senseless, and draining. Though it never made big money, Go Tell the Spartans has since been embraced as one of the most accurate Vietnam films ever made. It's the kind of movie where veterans leaned back, sighed, and said, "Yeah, that's exactly how it was." The Hill in Korea, 1956. If America largely ignored the Korean War, Britain gave it one rare film, The Hill in Korea. Released in 1956, it was the first feature about the conflict made in the UK, and it quietly captured the exhaustion of soldiers stuck in a war the world wanted to forget. The plot follows a British patrol cut off and surrounded, forced to fight against staggering odds. What made the film stand out wasn't the gunfire or the trenches, it was the faces. Many extras were actual veterans, men who had been there just a few years earlier, and their weary authenticity bleeds through the screen. The filmmakers didn't sugarcoat the mud, fear, and frustration. Instead of endless heroics, we see soldiers stumbling through exhaustion, clinging to discipline even when hope fades. For British audiences, it was a sobering reminder of a war that had claimed thousands of their own, but was already slipping into obscurity. The Hill in Korea never became a global hit, but veterans respected it as one of the only films that treated their sacrifices with honesty. It remains a haunting testament to what it felt like to fight in a war almost forgotten before it even ended. Battleground, 1949. Most World War II movies of the 1940s were morale boosters. But Battleground? It was mud-caked, bone-chilling reality. Directed by William Wellman, himself a World War I veteran, the film followed a group of American paratroopers trapped in the siege of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Forget glossy propaganda, this one was all frostbite, foxholes, and desperation. The soldiers don't look like posters for recruitment. They look like men who haven't slept in days, wrapped in blankets, gnawing on frozen food, cursing the weather as much as the enemy. Veterans who fought in Europe saw themselves on screen for the first time. Their reality wasn't about constant heroics. It was about surviving cold nights, wondering if reinforcements would ever come. The production had military advisors who had actually been there. MGM originally thought the film was too bleak, but test audiences and veterans disagreed. They embraced it for its honesty. Even General Omar Bradley, who commanded at Bastogne, praised it for getting the details right. Battleground ended up a critical and commercial success, but strangely, it faded behind louder, flashier WW2 films. Veterans, though, never forgot it. They respected that this movie captured the simple, awful truth. Sometimes the toughest enemy wasn't bullets. It was the cold and the weight. Men in War. 1957. Anthony Mann's Men in War didn't bother with patriotic speeches. It's a Korean War film that plays like a pressure cooker, where every second on screen crackles with tension. Robert Ryan plays a weary lieutenant trying to keep his depleted platoon alive. Aldo Ray storms in as a tough-as-nails sergeant who doesn't care about rules, only survival. The plot? Simple. Get across enemy territory before time runs out. But what unfolds is a brutal study in leadership, fatigue, and the crushing weight of command. Veterans respected its honesty. The soldiers aren't clean-shaven heroes, they're dirty, ragged, and exhausted. The war isn't noble, it's endless. What really sold the authenticity was the focus on small details. The long silences, the constant scanning of ridgelines, the nagging sense that death could come at any second. Man didn't aim for spectacle. He aimed for psychological realism, and veterans recognized it immediately. The movie wasn't a box office juggernaut. Audiences looking for thrills were put off by its bleakness. But among those who served, Men in War became a quiet classic. It's still remembered as one of the most painfully accurate depictions of what it felt like to slog through Korea's forgotten battlefields. Destination Tokyo, 1943. Starring Cary Grant, this World War II submarine drama was made during the war itself, but instead of propaganda gloss, it gave audiences a surprisingly detailed, authentic look at submarine life. The film follows an American sub on a dangerous mission into Japanese waters, where the crew faces everything from depth charges to claustrophobic isolation. Veterans of the Silent Service respected the movie for its technical accuracy. Submarine interiors were recreated in painstaking detail, right down to the crammed bunks, sweating pipes, and suffocating lack of privacy. The film avoided painting the men as invincible heroes. Instead, it showed them as ordinary sailors under extraordinary pressure, struggling with fear, fatigue, and impossible odds. What really stood out for veterans was how well the film captured the day-to-day grind of submarine duty. Long hours of silence, the constant threat of detection, the nerve-shattering tension of waiting for depth charges to explode. This was life under the waves. Cary Grant, usually known for charm and wit, gave one of his most grounded performances, portraying a captain balancing authority with compassion. While it served as wartime inspiration for home audiences, Destination Tokyo never slipped into fantasy. Veterans later remarked that, for a film made in the heat of war, it got the mood right. It reminded them not of speeches and parades, but of the claustrophobic struggle of life below the surface. Today it's remembered as one of the most authentic submarine films of its era, praised for respecting the experiences of the men who actually lived it. Pork Chop Hill, 1959. If one film captured the sheer futility of the Korean War, it was Pork Chop Hill. Gregory Peck stars as an officer leading troops to seize a hill that even the commanders admit has no real value. The soldiers bleed, sweat, and die for a patch of dirt destined to be abandoned. This wasn't Hollywood patriotism, it was tragedy. Veterans who fought in Korea saw the pointlessness they had lived through reflected in every frame. The film showed young soldiers grappling with exhaustion, terror, and the realization that victory could mean nothing. Director Louis Milestone, who had made All Quiet on the Western Front decades earlier, knew how to strip away false heroics. His style leaned on grit, mud, and men slumped against sandbags with hollow eyes. Critics praised Gregory Peck's leadership performance, but veterans praised the details, the confusion of night attacks, the frantic radio calls, the endless waiting between bursts of violence. Pork Chop Hill wasn't a runaway commercial success, but for those who'd fought in Korea, it mattered. They said it showed the one truth most war movies avoided. Sometimes you fight, you lose friends, and the world barely notices. Fixed Bayonets, 1951. Before Fuller made the big red one, he gave audiences another brutally honest war film, Fixed Bayonets. Set during the Korean War, it follows an inexperienced corporal suddenly thrust into command when his superiors are picked off one by one. This wasn't about gallantry. It was about responsibility crushing down on a man who never wanted it. Veterans praised the film for capturing the terrifying reality of leadership in combat, the weight of making life or death calls for men who look to you for answers, even when you're just as scared. Fuller's fingerprints are all over it. The man knew combat. He had lived it. His screenplay emphasizes exhaustion, fear, and the randomness of survival. The soldiers aren't invincible. They're cold, frightened, and desperate to make it through. Fixed Bayonets was praised for its realism and even used by military schools as a teaching tool, but mainstream audiences overlooked it, preferring more polished war films of the era. Veterans, though, latched onto its truth. The movie said out loud what they'd all felt. Being a hero often meant nothing more than doing your job while scared out of your mind. Attack, 1956. What happens when the officer in charge is the real enemy? That's the central fire burning through attack, a World War II drama directed by Robert Aldrich. Jack Palance plays a lieutenant who's brave and battle-hardened, while Eddie Albert plays a cowardly captain who repeatedly puts his men at risk to save his own skin. This wasn't a film about noble sacrifice. It was about betrayal from within. Veterans responded to that with a knowing shake of the head because they'd seen it. Leaders who froze in combat. Commanders who hid while others bled. Aldrich didn't shy away from showing the chaos and rage this sparked among the ranks. The Army hated it, fearing it undermined the image of military leadership. But veterans said it rang truer than the polished portraits and recruitment ads. The movie's final act, a furious confrontation between Palance and Albert under fire, still hits like a grenade. It was less about battlefield glory and more about the terrifying consequences of cowardice at the top. Attack! Didn't get the box office love of bigger war epics, but it earned something far more important. Credibility with the men who knew what it felt like to be let down by someone wearing bars on their shoulders. Fires on the Plain, 1959. If most war films are about glory, Fires on the Plain is about what happens when all of that is stripped away and nothing remains but hunger and despair. Directed by Kon Ichikawa, this Japanese masterpiece doesn't glorify combat. It shows the brutal, soul-crushing reality of soldiers abandoned to die in the Philippines during the final days of World War II. The story follows a tubercular soldier, Private Tamura, turned out by his own unit because he's too sick to fight and too much of a burden to feed. Wandering through a landscape littered with corpses and starving survivors, Tamura encounters comrades who have been reduced to shadows of themselves. The jungle isn't just a backdrop, it's a graveyard. Bullets are scarce, food scarcer, and hope nearly extinct. Veterans respected the film's honesty. They knew that war wasn't always about climactic battles. More often, it was about survival in mud, about watching men wither away, about the quiet horror of realizing the enemy wasn't just across the line, it was disease, starvation, and hopelessness. Fires on the Plain captured that in a way few films ever dared. At the time of its release, the movie shocked audiences in Japan. It was criticized for being too bleak, too harsh, too unpatriotic. But that rawness is what made it resonate with soldiers. No propaganda, no speeches, no victories, just the truth of what happens when armies collapse and men are left behind. Fires on the Plain has since been restored and praised as one of the most important anti-war films ever made. For veterans, it was the rare movie that didn't try to make their sacrifices pretty. It showed what war really costs when everything else is gone. The Young Lions, 1958. Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift, and Dean Martin, three powerhouse actors. One bold war film that dared to show humanity on both sides of World War, The Young Lions. Adapted from Irwin Shaw's novel, followed three men. A German soldier disillusioned by the Nazi cause, a Jewish private fighting prejudice within his own army, and a playboy drafted into combat. Unlike typical war dramas of its era, The Young Lions avoided simple good versus evil tropes. Brando's German officer wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a man struggling with conscience and duty. Montgomery Clift's Jewish soldier fought battles inside his own unit, as anti-Semitism simmered alongside the larger war. Dean Martin's character, initially reluctant, grew into his role as a soldier. Veterans appreciated the nuance. They knew war wasn't black and white. It was contradictions, doubts, and men who carried baggage into battle. The film's refusal to paint anyone as flawless heroes or faceless monsters felt closer to the complexity they remembered. It was long, sometimes uneven, and critics debated its politics. But The Young Lions stood out as one of the first mainstream films to say out loud, war is fought by individuals, each with their own fears, flaws, and humanity. And that's why veterans said it got the essence right. The Men, 1950. Before Brando electrified Hollywood with A Streetcar Named Desire, he made his film debut in The Men, a quiet, devastating story about veterans coming home broken. Directed by Fred Zinnemann, it focused on soldiers paralyzed in combat, confined to wheelchairs, and struggling to find their place in a world that had moved on without them. This wasn't the triumphant return parades promised. This was reality. Marriages under strain, bitterness simmering, and hope running thin. Brando lived in a veterans hospital for a month to prepare, learning how to maneuver a wheelchair and immersing himself in the daily lives of real paraplegic vets. Many of them appear in the film as extras. The result was so authentic that veterans both praised and criticized it. Some said it finally showed their truth. Others said it was too harsh, too raw, too depressing. But nearly all agreed. It wasn't Hollywood fantasy. It was the closest thing to what they felt waking up in hospitals with futures they didn't recognize. The Men wasn't a huge hit, but for those who served, it mattered. It told them that at least once Hollywood remembered that war didn't end when the shooting stopped. It ended in quiet hospital rooms, with lives forever changed. They were expendable. 1945, directed by John Ford and starring John Wayne and Robert Montgomery, They Were Expendable might sound like a typical flag-waving Whodey film, but dig deeper, and you'll find one of the most brutally honest depictions of loss and sacrifice Hollywood dared to release during wartime. The story follows PT boat crews in the Philippines as they fight against overwhelming Japanese forces after Pearl Harbor. The title alone tells you the message. These men weren't heroes destined for glory. They were pawns sent to hold the line, knowing their odds of survival were slim. What made it resonate with veterans was Ford's refusal to sugarcoat. The combat sequences are tense but not triumphant. The mood is somber, haunted by the knowledge that victory is out of reach. Robert Montgomery, himself a former Navy officer who commanded PT boats, brought first-hand experience to the role, adding credibility veterans immediately spotted. Released while the war was still raging, the film was both a tribute and a warning. The Navy cooperated with production, but veterans knew the truth in its title. Sometimes soldiers were sent into battles they couldn't win, and their sacrifices barely made the headlines. For veterans, They Were Expendable wasn't just a movie. It was an echo of reality, a reminder that some stories were told, not to inspire, but to honor. War films usually sell us tidy victories and clean uniforms. But these 15 forgotten gems, they showed the dirt under the fingernails, the fear in the foxholes, and the leadership that sometimes failed. That's why veterans swore they got it right. Which of these films surprised you most, and which do you think deserves a modern revival? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit subscribe, and keep the conversation alive.